February 20th, 1944 began, like countless other winter mornings in the Reich. Frost clung to the eaves of farmhouses. Chimneys leaked ribbons of smoke into the pale sky, and railway workers stamped their boots against the cold as they prepared the day's transports. Yet across Germany, something far more ominous was stirring. Radar stations from the Low Countries to the Baltic began reporting strange patterns. Operators squinted at their screens, rubbing tired eyes, believing at first that their equipment was malfunctioning. Nothing in the air war to that point could account for what they were seeing. And then the dots multiplied. Oberleutnant Victor Heiss, a radar technician at the station near Dielen, felt a chill crawl down his spine. Waves of signals were appearing in a concentration he had never encountered. He replayed the sweep again, hoping the confusion would resolve itself into something familiar. Instead, hundreds of returns pulsed across the screen, merging into a mass so large that individual aircraft could no longer be distinguished. Heiss stepped back. He knew the Luftwaffe had been warning for months that American production was accelerating. But no one had imagined anything like this. He swallowed and shouted for his commanding officer. In Berlin, General Friedrich Fink of the Luftwaffe's Air Defense Command received the same reports within minutes. He stared at the classified map as black markers representing bomber formations began moving eastward like a rising tide. He had studied the American 8th Air Force for years and believed he understood its patterns. Yet the sheer size of this incoming force defied every assumption. If the estimates were even close, thousands of aircraft were in the air simultaneously. Fink felt a knot form in his chest. The Reich was facing something entirely new. On an airfield outside Leibniz, 19-year-old mechanic Karl Drescher was scraping ice from the wing of a Bf-109 when he heard the distant rumble of engines. At first, he assumed it was the morning patrol taking off from another base. Then the sound deepened into a thunderous vibration that rolled through the ground beneath his boots. He straightened and scanned the horizon. The sky was empty, yet the roar intensified. Pilots and ground crew alike paused, listening as the unseen force grew louder. A few exchanged uneasy glances. The sound seemed too vast, too heavy, as if a storm were gathering far above the clouds. An hour later, the storm revealed itself. American B-17 and B-24s, organized in tight combat boxes, pierced the haze in endless ranks. Pilots who had faced Allied bombers before had grown accustomed to their formations. But nothing prepared them for this sight. The air seemed filled with them from horizon to horizon. Even seasoned veterans froze for a moment, awestruck by the magnitude of the armada. One pilot would later write that it looked as though the sky itself had grown steel feathers. Drescher's squadron scrambled to ready their aircraft. Mechanics worked with frantic precision, slamming ammunition belts into place and topping off fuel tanks as officers shouted orders. Pilots strapped themselves into their cockpits with silent determination. Many had been flying since the early years of the war, when the Luftwaffe dominated Europe. But this was not 1940. And the men in those aircraft were exhausted. The fuel shortages, the lack of spare parts, the dwindling numbers of experienced pilots, all had worn them down. Still, they took to the air. Duty demanded it. Above them, the American formations advanced steadily, bristling with machine guns and escorted by long-range P-51 Mustangs. The Germans had known the new fighters were coming, but few had truly believed the rumors that these aircraft could escort bombers deep into the Reich and back again. As the first silver shapes appeared alongside the bombers, One pilot felt his stomach tighten. He had once told his comrades that the appearance of a long-range fighter powerful enough to outmatch the 109 would change everything. Now, the proof glinted above him like a blade. Inside one of the lead B-17s, Captain Samuel Hartman checked his instruments as his crew scanned the skies for enemy fighters. Hartman had flown missions over Germany before, but the briefings for Big Week had made it clear that this operation was different. The objective was not a single factory or rail yard, but the destruction of the Luftwaffe itself. Not just planes or buildings, but the German Air Force as a fighting force. The American commanders believed that if they destroyed enough fighters, enough fuel depots, enough aircraft plants, the sky over Europe would finally belong to the Allies. Hartman understood the stakes. The invasion of Western Europe depended on breaking the Luftwaffe's power. As the bombers pushed deeper into German airspace, the first wave of Luftwaffe fighters rose to meet them. The pilots formed defensive patterns and prepared to attack the bomber boxes. Hartman braced himself. He had seen too many crews torn apart by concentrated fighter attacks. Yet something different happened that morning. Instead of the relentless assaults that had once shredded Allied formations, the German attacks felt scattered and thin. Small groups of fighters lunged toward the bombers, but were quickly intercepted by P-51s. Dogfights erupted across the sky, spiraling contrails marking the duels. But the once feared German formations never materialized in full strength. On the ground, Fink received reports that startled him. Several airfields could launch only half of their expected squadrons because the mechanics lacked replacement engines. Other bases had aircraft, but no fuel. Worse still, inexperienced pilots made up a growing portion of the force. Veterans who had survived years of combat watched in despair as young boys with only a handful of flight hours went up to face overwhelming odds. One ace slammed his fist against the briefing table, shouting that sending these boys into battle was the same as murder. Back in the skies, Karl Drescher watched in horror as a friend he had known since childhood was shot down within minutes of engaging the bombers. The plane spun into a cloud and vanished. Part of Karl wanted to dive after him, but the air was filled with swarming aircraft. A P-51 streaked past his canopy, guns firing, and he jerked his stick to evade. His engine sputtered under the strain, an all-too common problem in the final years of the war. He managed to stabilize his aircraft and retreat from the fight, heart pounding. Meanwhile, the bombing began. Wave after wave of explosives rained down on aircraft factories, engine plants, and assembly lines. The roar of detonations rippled through industrial districts as workers fled or threw themselves to the ground. Fires erupted across factory floors. Precision tools, fuselage frames, and half-finished fighter parts were blown apart. Entire workshops collapsed. The German air defense network strained desperately to respond, but the bombers kept coming, and behind them came more. By midday, the first reports from across the Reich painted a picture of devastation. The Regensburg aircraft plant was in flames. Gotha's assembly lines had been hit. Leipzig's factories were sending up columns of black smoke visible for miles. In Berlin, officials tried to make sense of the situation as messengers rushed in with new damage reports. One officer muttered that the Americans were not launching a single mission, but an industrial assault. Another whispered that if this continued for days, the Luftwaffe would not survive. That night, Heiss stood outside his station, staring at the dim stars above the silent forest. The day had changed something fundamental. His equipment, his training, and the confidence once instilled by the Reich's propaganda had not prepared him for what he had witnessed. He understood now that Germany was facing a power unlike anything it had imagined. This was not a battle fought on even terms. This was the weight of American factories, workers, and steel falling from the sky. The week had only just begun, yet its meaning was already unmistakable. The skies over Germany were no longer German skies. They belonged to whoever could fill them with more aircraft, more fuel, more machines, and more men. And that power now lay firmly with the United States. As the fires smoldered across the factories that night, a heavy truth settled over the Reich. The air war had changed forever, and the German soldiers who looked upward into the darkening sky understood with growing dread that this was only the beginning. The second day of Big Week dawned over Germany, with a faint orange glow spreading across the horizon. It might have been a normal sunrise, but the haze that hung in the air carried the scent of ash, burnt metal, and pulverized brick. Smoke still drifted from bombed industrial districts, rising in thin columns that stretched into the cold sky. Workers heading to morning shifts paused to study the damage as they crossed ruined courtyards and broken rail lines. The war they once believed distant had pressed into the very heart of the Reich's industrial arteries. In the Bavarian town of Augsburg, where Messerschmitt factories formed the backbone of fighter production, men and women gathered outside the shattered gates with pale faces. Clara Weber, an assembly specialist who had worked on Bf 109 fuselages for 5 years, stood among them, clutching her lunch tin. She saw the twisted metal beams, the scorched walls, and the bomb craters that had swallowed entire workshops. Her supervisor stepped onto a piece of rubble to make an announcement. His voice wavered as he told them that only a fraction of the facility remained operational, and that emergency teams were working to clear debris. Many of her co-workers stared forward with hollow eyes. Others whispered to each other in disbelief. For months, they had heard rumors that American factories were outproducing Germany 10-1. Now the proof lay in ruins before them. Hundreds of kilometers away, the pilots preparing to defend these factories were receiving urgent briefings. At the base in Vernachen, Major Otto Wall studied aerial photographs of the damage inflicted the day before. He had flown against American bombers since 1943, but he had never seen so many targets hit in such a short time. The photographs revealed factories gutted by fire, engine plants flattened, and rail yards choked with wrecked freight cars. He knew what this meant. Every destroyed machine tool, every damaged assembly line, every ruined storage depot was one more plane Germany would never build. The Luftwaffe was running out of time. Wall turned to face the young pilots gathered before him. Half of them were recent replacements, many with fewer than 40 hours of flight time. He tried to maintain a calm tone as he emphasized that their mission was to intercept and break up the formations before they reached the industrial zones. He did not tell them how little chance they had of stopping what was coming. The room fell silent as an aide rushed in with a fresh report from radar stations along the Dutch coast. The Americans were forming up again. The scale matched or exceeded the previous day. Wall closed his eyes for a moment before ordering his men to their aircraft. Across the Channel in England, American air crews were suiting up. Inside a briefing hut on a foggy airfield in Suffolk, Colonel James Hargrove pointed to a massive wall map. Red strings traced the routes the bomber groups would take. Thin black markers represented Luftwaffe airfields, flak batteries, and known fighter assembly plants. Hargrove's voice carried an unmistakable urgency. Big Week was not just about dropping bombs. It was about forcing the Luftwaffe into the air where Allied fighters could tear it apart. If the Germans refused to fight, their factories would be destroyed. If they fought, they would lose pilots they could not replace. In the second row of seats, Sergeant Michael Mick Lawson pulled on his leather gloves while listening to the briefing. He had flown missions over Schweinfurt and Bremen and still carried the memories of friends lost during those brutal raids. But Hargrove made it clear that this week was different. The Americans had massed their largest bomber forces yet, supported by a growing fleet of P-51s and P-47s. This was the first time Lawson sensed that the tide might decisively turn. Hours later, engines roared to life across dozens of English air bases. Bomber crews performed final checks as the cold wind whipped across the tarmac. Ground crews waved the aircraft into formation. One by one, the bombers rose into the gray morning sky until thousands of engines hummed in unison. The sheer sound rolled across the countryside like thunder. German radar stations picked up the incoming waves before they reached the coast. At once, warnings spread through Luftwaffe command centers. Phones rang without pause. Officers barked instructions. Fighter groups were ordered to scramble immediately. In the operations bunker near Berlin, General Fink studied the map as fresh reports arrived. The Americans had launched multiple massive formations, all converging on key industrial centers. Fink gripped the edge of the table as he realized the scale. This was not an air raid. It was a strategic assault designed to break the backbone of German aviation. High above the clouds, the bombers crossed into German airspace. Columns of vapor stretched behind them. The pilots could see the sun glint off the wings of neighboring aircraft. Some tried to count the number of planes, but the formations were too vast. Lawson glanced through the side window and felt a surge of awe. He knew somewhere far to his left and right, thousands more aircraft were flying parallel routes. The sky belonged to the Allies that morning. Minutes later, German fighters rose to meet them. Wall and his squadron climbed rapidly, engines screaming. He could feel the strain on his aircraft, which had undergone hurried repairs after shortages, delayed maintenance. As they approached the bomber stream, he saw the first P-51s diving toward them. The silver fighters moved with an ease that made his stomach tighten. The battles that followed were chaotic and brutal. Wall managed to fire a short burst at a B-17 before being driven off by escorting fighters. Explosions flashed around him as tracers streaked across the sky. He pulled away sharply when his canopy rattled from a near miss. Down below, German anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The sky darkened as thousands of shells burst into black clouds around the bombers. The crews braced for impact as flak shrapnel clanged against the fuselage. Lawson gripped his chair as a shockwave rattled the aircraft. Someone behind him shouted that they had lost an engine. The pilot fought to maintain formation. Even damaged, the bombers continued their advance. Then the bombs fell. In Leipzig, workers on the factory floor heard sirens wail as they scrambled for shelter. The first explosions tore through roof beams and smashed machinery. Flames consumed stacks of aircraft components. The impact shook the ground like an earthquake. Clara Weber's relatives, working at a plant miles away, later described panels of reinforced steel being ripped apart by the blast. Conveyor belts twisted into molten heaps. In Bernburg, a plant producing Junkers engines sustained direct hits that ignited fuel stores. Firefighters struggled to control the inferno. Thick smoke billowed upward, visible from neighboring towns. German officials surveyed the destruction with grim expressions. One engineer told his colleagues that rebuilding would take months, if not longer. Another estimated that the plant had lost a third of its production capacity in a single hour. As fires raged across multiple cities, the Luftwaffe continued fighting desperately in the skies. WAL regrouped with surviving pilots, only to find that half their squadron was missing. Some had been shot down. Others had ditched or crash-landed. He looked at the faces of the young men who had made it back. Their expressions reflected exhaustion, fear, and disbelief. How could they fight an enemy that seemed to produce aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them? On the bomber's return flight, Lawson stared through the small side window. He saw plumes of smoke rising from dozens of impact zones. Even from miles above, he could tell that something decisive had happened. There were fewer German fighters harassing them now. P-51s escorted the damaged planes safely back toward the channel. As they crossed into friendly airspace, relief washed through the bomber crews. That evening, American commanders reviewed the results. Reports indicated extensive damage across key industrial areas. More important than the destruction itself was the Luftwaffe's response. They had been forced into the air in large numbers, and losses among German pilots were mounting rapidly. Hargrove stood before his men and told them that Big Week was working. The Luftwaffe was being broken not only by bombs, but by attrition. In Germany, the mood was far darker. Fink met with senior officers who described a crisis in fighter production. Factories needed days just to clear debris. Transportation lines were disrupted. Skilled workers had been killed or wounded. As he listened, Fink understood the grim reality. The Reich had always relied on engineering skill and determination. But the Americans fought with numbers that seemed to defy logic. Factories across the United States were operating around the clock, pouring out aircraft, engines, and ammunition on a scale Germany could not match. As night settled across the damaged cities, Clara Weber walked home along a dim street. She looked back at the ruins of the factories she had served for years. The fires still glowed faintly. She felt a dull ache in her chest, not just from fear, but from the realization that something irreversible had begun. Germany was fighting an enemy with a storm of steel, fuel, and machinery that could not be stopped by courage alone. The next morning would bring new raids and new devastation. But even before the sun rose, everyone who had seen the sky that day understood that the balance of the war was shifting. American industrial might had begun to crush the Luftwaffe's will and its means to resist, and Germany's defenders braced themselves for the days that lay ahead. The third day of Big Week dawned with a bitterness that seeped into every corner of the Luftwaffe. Frost glazed the tarmac at dozens of German airfields, coating grounded fighters with a pale shimmer that made them look like relics abandoned in the cold. Mechanics shuffled across the icy ground carrying toolkits and fuel hoses, their breath billowing in the frigid air. Some had slept only a few hours. Others had not slept at all. As the sun lifted above the tree line, the faint glow revealed the true state of Germany's once mighty Air Force. At Jagdgeschwader 26's base near Stade, Oberfeldwebel Karl Drescher rubbed his swollen eyes. He had survived 2 days of combat, and though he still had a functioning aircraft, his nerves felt flayed. He watched ground crews inspect bullet-riddled fuselages and cracked landing gear. One mechanic removed a mangled propeller blade from a Bf-109 and tossed it aside. It clattered across the concrete, the sound echoing like a grim announcement. Nearby, several young pilots stood together in a small circle. They barely spoke. Their faces were sharp with fear and fatigue. Carl joined them and studied the lineup of fighters on the field. Some engines refused to start in the cold. Others lacked replacement parts. A handful had been cannibalized to keep a few airworthy. A sergeant approached with a clipboard and informed them that they would need to fly again within the hour. The American bombers were already crossing the coast. Carl felt his stomach sink. He wanted to believe that their fighters could still make a difference, but deep down he sensed that the battle was slipping beyond their control. In a command bunker outside Wiesbaden, General Friedrich Fink stood before a wall map littered with red markers. Each symbol represented damage from the previous raids. Some were aircraft factories reduced to smoking shells. Others were fuel depots hit so severely that aviation gasoline levels had plunged by alarming percentages. Officers filed fresh reports into his hands. Pilot losses were becoming catastrophic. Many of the most experienced aviators had been shot down in the first 2 days. Replacement pilots were too few and too green. One commander admitted that he had sent up boys who were barely out of flight school. They had died within minutes. Fink felt a deep exhaustion weighing on him. He remembered the early days of the war when the Luftwaffe seemed unstoppable. Germany had conquered skies over Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France with stunning speed. The Air Force had been the pride of the Reich. Now he watched it crumble under the relentless pressure of thousands of Allied aircraft. He ran a hand through his thinning hair and murmured that they were witnessing the unraveling of everything the Luftwaffe had built. Across the Channel in England, the American bomber crews were preparing for another massive strike. Inside a mess hall warmed by pot-belly stoves, Captain Samuel Hartman sipped coffee while studying the day's flight plan. The maps showed new targets, engine plants, ball-bearing factories, and fighter assembly halls that German commanders were desperate to protect. The briefing officer emphasized that the Luftwaffe was growing weaker, but the raiders could not become complacent. Flak batteries still ringed the cities. German fighters would rise again, and they would fight savagely because they had no other choice. Hartman nodded and stood to leave. Outside, the sight of endless rows of bombers waiting on the airfield filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. American industrial power was on full display. Ground crews moved with precision, loading bombs, fueling engines, and checking hydraulics. The cold air vibrated with the promise of another assault. When the bombers finally took to the sky, the formations were so large they cast fleeting shadows over the landscape below. A British farmer paused his work and gazed upward, listening to the drone of engines that rolled like a wave over the countryside. He whispered to his wife that Germany would feel the weight of that sky soon enough. German radar stations tracked the incoming waves. At Dielen, Victor Heiss leaned over his screen as the blips converged into a dense mass. He motioned to his superior and reported the size of the force. His voice wavered. The numbers were staggering. This was not merely a continuation of the previous raids. It was an escalation. The Americans were pouring more aircraft into Big Week than the Luftwaffe could possibly counter. The officer beside him stiffened and whispered that the Reich had never faced anything on this scale. Minutes later, sirens blared across German airfields. Pilots scrambled toward their fighters. Carl tightened his flight harness as mechanics gave him a quick thumbs up. The engine roared to life, though it sputtered briefly before stabilizing. He taxied toward the runway, surrounded by a small formation of aircraft that looked alarmingly thin compared to the legions of American bombers he knew were approaching. In the air, the German fighters climbed into the winter sky, their engines straining in the cold. Karl's squadron joined others forming defensive lines. He glanced across the formation and saw faces set with grim determination. Many of these men had flown since the first day of the war. They understood better than anyone how dire the situation had become. Then the Americans appeared, first as distant specks, then as a vast, shimmering cloud of aircraft stretching across the horizon. Karl felt his breath catch as he saw the scale of the incoming force. Combat boxes of B-17s flew in disciplined ranks, each bristling with machine guns. Columns of P-51s and P-47s wove above and around them, creating a shield that seemed impossible to break. Major Otto Wall, flying at the head of a different squadron, surveyed the sky with professional calm. He had survived countless missions, but the sight before him was unlike any battle he had faced. He keyed his radio and gave the order to attack. German fighters dove toward the bombers. Some fired short bursts before the escorts intercepted them. Dogfights erupted instantly. Wall found himself locked in a twisting battle with a P-51. The American aircraft moved with a grace and speed he struggled to match. After a brief, desperate maneuver, he broke away, but a burst of .50 caliber fire shattered one of his wings. His aircraft spiraled aside downward. He managed to bail out and parachuted into a snowy field where local farmers ran to help him. When he regained his breath, he stared upward at the sky full of aircraft and realized the truth. The Luftwaffe had passed the point of no return. Karl was still airborne, wrestling his Bf-109 through a raging battle. He fired at a bomber and saw sparks erupt across its fuselage, but seconds later he came under heavy fire from an escorting Mustang. He rolled sharply and escaped, but his left wing was riddled with holes. The engine coughed violently. He knew he had to disengage. As he descended toward his airfield, he saw fire rising from the town beyond. Bombs were already falling. On the ground, anti-aircraft crews fought to repel the waves of bombers. The air filled with thunder as black flak bursts dotted the sky. Yet the bombers pressed forward. Bomb bay doors opened and steel rained down on the factories below. Explosions tore through assembly lines. Great machines buckled under the force. Storage tanks ignited and sent towers of flame roaring upward. The industrial heart of Germany began to crumble. In the aftermath of the raid, Fink toured several damaged installations. Workers dug through rubble searching for survivors. Ambulances ferried the injured away. Smoke drifted across streets where entire neighborhoods had been flattened. As he stepped over shattered gearboxes and broken engines, Fink knew he was witnessing the collapse of the Luftwaffe's capacity to wage war. Without factories, fuel, and experienced pilots, Germany's air force was no longer a decisive weapon. It was now a symbol of a struggle it could no longer sustain. Back at Karl's base, the surviving pilots gathered near the flight line. There were fewer of them than the day before. Some stared blankly at the empty spots where aircraft had once stood. Mechanics approached slowly, their shoulders sagging. One man whispered that they had no replacement engines left. Another said that fuel reserves were almost gone. Karl removed his flight helmet and looked at the sky. For the first time, it felt alien to him. The winter air seemed heavier, colder, as if it carried the weight of defeat. That night, as the fires of burning factories glowed across the horizon, German commanders drafted urgent messages to Berlin. They warned that unless something changed immediately, the Luftwaffe would lose the war in the air. But the truth was already written in the darkened sky above them. The Luftwaffe was breaking. Its pilots were exhausted, its aircraft crippled, and its factories burning. And the Americans were still coming. The fourth morning of Big Week carried a different kind of silence across Germany. It was not the calm before a storm, but the exhausted lull of a nation that had already been battered by days of fire and steel. Streets in industrial cities lay dusted with gray ash blown from smoldering factories. Families stepped out of cramped shelters and stared at the ruins of neighborhoods that once buzzed with life. Daylight exposed the devastation with brutal clarity. Firefighters still battled flames in some districts, while workers shoveled debris to clear emergency paths. Above them, the sky remained an empty pale blue. But everyone understood that emptiness never lasted long. At Focke-Wulf's main facility in Marienburg, engineer Matthias Eckhart walked across what had once been one of the Luftwaffe's most important manufacturing centers. Puddles reflected the twisted skeletons of collapsed buildings. The factory floor, normally alive with the sound of machinery and hammering tools, was now a charred wasteland. He paused beside the remains of an assembly line where WWII fuselages had been neatly arranged only days earlier. Now they lay shattered and scorched. A colleague approached him with soot on his face and a shaken expression. He whispered that production would stop for weeks, maybe months. Matthias looked at the destruction and realized the Luftwaffe had suffered a wound it could not heal. Hundreds of kilometers away, General Friedrich Fink listened to the latest situation reports inside the hardened command bunker near Berlin. His officers delivered grim numbers. Day after day, the American raids were increasing in size. Fighter losses had reached alarming levels. Factories essential for aircraft engines, ball bearings, and airframes were no longer able to meet even half their output targets. Fink rested both hands on the edge of the table and stared at the map. Red markers from previous raids formed a patchwork across central and southern Germany. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was no longer a shield, but a threadbare curtain struggling to cover a collapsing front. Despite the devastation, new alarms began ringing as radar stations tracked fresh formations leaving British airfields. The Americans were coming again. On the Norfolk coast, a cold wind rustled through the open bomb bay doors of dozens of B-17s lined across the airfield. Air crews moved in practiced rhythm as armorers loaded bombs and technicians calibrated instruments. Inside a briefing hut, Captain Samuel Hartmann studied the flight plan. The target list was concise, but deadly serious. The remaining engine plants in central Germany, a major aircraft assembly works near Brunswick, and a series of fuel depots that the Luftwaffe desperately depended on. Commanders emphasized that the enemy was weakening fast, but remained dangerous. A cornered opponent always fought with desperation. Hartmann nodded as his commanding officer concluded the briefing with a stark reminder. The objective of Big Week was not simply to damage German industry. It was to break the Luftwaffe so completely that it could not contest the air during the coming invasion of Europe. If the Germans still had fighters in strength when Allied troops crossed the Channel, thousands of soldiers would die. What happened in the sky in February would shape the ground war that followed. The engines roared to life shortly after dawn. Waves of bombers lifted into the air, their wings glinting in the winter sun. From the ground, they rose like a steel tide. Entire villages in England paused to watch the procession. Children pointed upward, and older men stood silently, knowing those aircraft would soon cross into a battlefield where the cold sky showed no mercy. In Germany, Oberfeldwebel Karl Drescher sat in the cockpit of his Bf 109, staring through a frost-covered canopy. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the throttle. The base around him buzzed with tense activity, but it lacked the vigor of earlier years. Fewer aircraft lined the field. Even fewer pilots stood ready to fly them. Mechanics worked with grim determination, patching bullet holes and coaxing damaged engines back to life. They all knew that their efforts were buying only a little time. As Karl taxied onto the runway, he wondered how many more days the Luftwaffe could continue like this. He thought about the young pilots who had joined them only days earlier. Many were gone now. Some had died without firing a shot. Their absence hung over the unit like a shadow. Moments later, German fighters climbed into the sky to intercept the incoming threat. The cold air stung Karl's face as he ascended through a layer of thin clouds. When he reached altitude, his eyes widened at the sight before him. The American formations were even larger than the previous days. Bombers flew in disciplined grid-like patterns, each box flanked by escort fighters. Sunlight reflected off their wings, turning them into a glittering wall of metal stretching across the horizon. Reluctantly, Karl keyed his radio and acknowledged his squadron leader's order to engage. He tightened his grip on the controls and dove toward the bombers, hoping to break up the formation. The moment he approached striking distance, a swarm of P-51 Mustangs descended. The escorts moved with deadly precision, cutting off the German attack. Tracer rounds zipped past Karl's canopy. He banked sharply, feeling the aircraft shudder under the strain. One of his comrades fired at a bomber, but was immediately set upon by two Mustangs. Within seconds, his fighter erupted into flames. The sky above central Germany erupted into chaos. Dogfights spiraled in every direction. The thunder of explosions and the crack of machine gun fire echoed through the clouds. Yet for all the fury of the Luftwaffe pilots, they could not stem the tide. For every German fighter that rose, a pair of Allied escorts stepped in to block the attack. The air war had become a contest of endurance and numbers. And Germany no longer had either. As the American bombers reached their targets, the bomb bay doors opened in unison. Thousands of bombs dropped in roaring cascades. The shockwaves tore through industrial districts with merciless force. In Brunswick, entire workshops vanished inside rolling fireballs. Workers huddled in shelters as walls shook and windows shattered. Fuel depots erupted in towering pillars of flame that illuminated the sky for miles. From his bomber's window, Hartmann watched the destruction unfold far below. The fires burned so intensely that smoke climbed in thick columns, casting long shadows across the winter landscape. He reminded himself why they were there. Every German aircraft destroyed on the ground, every factory silenced, meant fewer Allied soldiers killed in the coming invasion. It was a brutal calculus, but one that war demanded. When the bombers turned for home, the sky behind them was filled with smoke and debris. The Luftwaffe tried to strike the retreating formations, but their attacks were faint and disorganized. Many had run low on fuel. Others were too damaged to continue. Karl himself eked out a final burst of speed to escape a pursuing Mustang. His engine sputtered and coughed. He barely managed to coax it back to base. Upon landing, Karl taxied his battered aircraft to the line and shut down the engine. He sat in the silence of the cockpit, unable to move for several seconds. Around him, mechanics rushed to the few returning fighters. Off to his right, he saw a stretcher carried past with a wounded pilot. Beyond that, an empty patch of runway marked the absence of aircraft that would never return. Inside the command bunker, Fink listened to the final reports of the day. Entire squadrons were reduced to only a handful of fighters. Some bases could no longer scramble more than 2 or 3 aircraft. Fuel reserves were critically low. Replacement parts were nearly exhausted. The Luftwaffe had been pushed past the limits of its endurance. As night fell, Fink stepped outside and looked toward the western sky. He saw faint glows on the horizon, where fires still burned from the day's bombardments. The air smelled of smoke and frozen earth. He understood the truth with a clarity that left him shaken. Big Week had not simply damaged the Luftwaffe. It had dismantled it. The Air Force that once dominated Europe was now a broken shell. Across the Channel, American crews landed safely back in England. Hartmann climbed down from his bomber and stretched his aching limbs. He felt weary, but relieved. His crew gathered around him, exchanging quiet words and tired smiles. They had survived another day. More importantly, they had struck another blow that would help bring the war closer to its end. Over the next hours, intelligence analysts delivered the results to Allied High Command. The numbers were staggering. Aircraft factories crippled, engine production slashed, thousands of German fighters lost in the air and on the ground. Replacement pilot pools nearly emptied. The Luftwaffe's defeat was no longer a prediction. It was a reality. And in that reality lay the future of Europe. With the skies cleared of serious German resistance, the Allies would soon marshal their forces for the invasion of Normandy. The men who stormed the beaches would do so under a sky dominated by American and British aircraft. A sky secured in the bitter cold days of Big Week. As dawn approached, the fires in Germany burned low. But the consequences of those days would shape the remainder of the war. In the silence of the early morning, as the last embers faded, the truth stood undeniable. The final reckoning had come, not with a single decisive battle, but with a relentless storm of bombers that revealed the full weight of American industrial power. And the Luftwaffe would never rise to challenge the skies again.